moving on as to why I came to end up studying about Christianity in the Middle East is I'm a vicar. I started off as a chaplain in Kuwait, and I was very interested to find out where the church came from in Kuwait. And to my surprise, there was very little in writing about the Christian history of the community there. And so I cobbled together some various sources and pulled them together in a book called The Christian Church in Kuwait. And also wanted to educate people a bit about Kuwait as a country. And many people are very surprised to learn Kuwait has a Christian church there. And when I moved to the United Arab Emirates a bit later on, the same thing happened. I discovered as I was trying to learn about the history of the church in the UAE, there was nothing in print. And so again, by finding various sources, I cobbled together a book called Christianity in the United Arab Emirates, Culture and Heritage. Then I went to work with the Al Amana Centre, which we'll learn a bit more about later on. And again, the same thing happened. There's really very little in writing about the history of Christianity in Oman. So as you can see, I became an accidental author. And I just found the whole topic fascinating and really wanted to share that knowledge with people, particularly back in my home country in England. So when I was studying for a PhD, one of the things that fascinated me as well as a vicar was how the different Islamic countries related to the church. And so you think of a country like Saudi Arabia, there is zero relationship with the church at the local level. There are no churches at all officially. So of course, there is a very large Christian population in Saudi Arabia. And part of the lack of relationship there is dictated by theology or the religious leaders who say, for a country to be authentically Islamic, we shouldn't really allow the religion to have a public voice. But it's not like that in other Islamic countries. And the experience of the church is so diverse. In Turkey, which has a secular constitution, which in theory means everyone has a freedom to worship and so on. In practice, I found Turkey was one of the hardest Christians in my Christian ministry to function as a leader in the community there. And but in Bahrain, you will find an extraordinary welcome from the King of Bahrain to the Christian community. And in Kuwait, you've got something in the middle where the Kuwaiti people allow the church to exist, but it's quite heavily regulated. So that led me to my sort of academic question, which is the experience of religious freedom in the Arabian Peninsula defined by the prevailing school of Islam of the individual country? And that's the other thing you notice when you travel around the Islamic world, is often there is an Islamic point of view, which is the official point of view for the country. So in Qatar, it's Wahhabi theology of a Hanbali school like Saudi Arabia. But what's really interesting between Saudi and Qatar is Qatar allows churches, but they follow the same Islamic school. And similarly, you've got in the United Arab Emirates and in Bahrain, you have the Maliki school of Islam, which is followed there, which argues for more tolerance, and it allows more flexibility in sort of interpreting Islamic law in the modern age. So you understand how the theology shapes the interaction between the government and the expatriate community. Oman is unique in that its main school of Islam is Ibadism. And the Ibadi school of Islam is not that well known outside of Oman or various parts of Zanzibar or North Africa. But in fact, it's a very old school of Islam which goes right back to the beginnings of Islam emerging at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Ibadism has become over time the mainstream of Islam, which shapes the identity of the normal Omani citizens. At least it did then. Things are changing, and I'll come back to that point a little bit further on. But in the meantime, I do want to tell you that the history of Christianity in Oman is very old indeed. And just coming back to talking about the different levels of religious freedoms in different countries, the United Arab Emirates, which follows the Maliki school of Islam, is home to over 40 church centres. Now, when I say a church centre, I'm not talking about a congregation. I'm talking about buildings which consist of many different halls, meeting places. I'm talking about, I suppose we would use the word campus. So these are places that host several congregations, often at the same time. When I was vicar in Abu Dhabi, we hosted every week 70 congregations in our facilities. In Dubai, we host up to 140 different congregations every week, numbering several thousand worshippers all the time. So these are big places. So we've got 40 centres like that in the United Arab Emirates, which is a huge number when you compare it to the next bigger collection of churches in the Arabian Gulf, which is Kuwait, followed by Bahrain, followed by Qatar, and then followed by Oman, and then Saudi, as you can see, does not yet have any official churches. And when we look at the percentage, one of the striking things about anyone going to visit the Arabian Gulf is the huge expatriate population. The migrant populations often outnumber local people. From the UAE, we've got 9% who are Christians, in Kuwait, 7% Christians, and so on. And when we get to Oman with a population of 4 million, 6.5% are Christians, which is around 300,000 Christians in a relatively small country. It's big in terms of land mass, but in terms of urban population centre, really quite small. But yet, 300,000 people live and worship as Christians in the country of Oman. So coming on to the experience of church, when you go to church, one of the biggest things you'll notice is competition for parking. And there you can see some decidedly unchristian behaviour as people compete and jostle for a parking space as close as possible to the church building because it's so hot. No one wants to walk into a place of worship sticky and sweaty. And more than once, I was called upon as a priest to break up fist fights in the car park between Christians wanting to come and pray. So it's astonishing the sheer numbers of people. Now, you might think that's amazing. People come and say, I had no idea Christians were so zealous and there were so many. But the pattern of worship in the Middle East is they tend to cluster all the churches in the same area of the city. So if you think of a typical town in England, you will have a church building scattered all over the town, even 2 or 3 on the same street. But imagine if in a typical town you just had one building and every Christian living in that town had to go to that one place. And suddenly it looks like there are hundreds and hundreds of worshippers in that town who no one's seen. And that's kind of what happened in the Middle East. There's not that many places you can go to. Everyone goes to the same area of town, and that leads to congestion and crowds. And when you do find a parking spot and you make your way into the compound, you immediately hear the noise. And the noise ranges from Greek Orthodox chanting ancient songs in their various different languages. You've got the fanatic Pentecostal drumming with the loudest hallelujahs you've ever heard in your life. You've got the Anglicans singing very sedately their traditional hymns. You will have the Korean Methodist Church trying to outdo the Anglicans in volume of their hymn singing. John Wesley sung in Korean, sounds absolutely amazing. So you're hit with this cacophony of sound, and you realize very quickly that what you see in Oman, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, is indeed global Christianity in all of its stripes and hues. And the biggest populations there are the Filipinos and the Indian, particularly the Roman Catholics. We've just marked the passing of Pope Francis, and we saw 250,000 people came to his funeral. When he came to Abu Dhabi, he held the largest Christian mass ever seen in that part of the world in all of its history. And I was privileged to join in the mass with around 128,000 Christians right in the heart of the Islamic world. It was an extraordinary experience. And this is kind of what you see, the packed queues. Every vicar would die to see something like this in their English parish. But it is an incredible place to visit. But one striking thing as you travel around the Middle East is nearly virtually all the churches are on the coast. There are cities inland, and of course, as we know, the empty quarter is there, it's a massive desert space, but there are towns in the interior with no official church places. There are Christian populations meeting there, but the official church buildings are all on the coast. And that reflects the openness of the culture in the maritime industry. So Salalah, Muscat, Sohar were all historical centers of trading with countries as far away as China, India, Persia, for centuries. And as you had this collision of traders all coming together in the same space, they became embedded in the local culture, sort of tolerant to people, well, who are different, who believe different things, who are not locals. And some people have suggested that actually in Oman there are two schools of Ibadi Islam. You've got the sort of tolerant, cuddly version in the maritime centres, and then you've got a more conservative culture in the interior who don't have the same level of exposure as people on the coast do. And so historically, the churches were built in the more sort of tolerant climate of coastal towns and centres. And that's true all around the Middle East. It's rare to find ancient churches in the interior of Arabia. There are some, but those that are found in the interior, often you realize they're part of an ancient trade route where people traveled through and connected with it. So it seems that tolerance of Islamic communities is linked directly to the economy or trade. So that's just by way of observation, and indeed that's where the churches are today in Oman. So moving on to the origins of Christianity, we trace the early sort of church movement in Arabia to St. Thomas. If you remember the story from the Gospels of doubting Thomas, who then overcame his doubt and went on to become a formidable missionary preacher and pastor, starting in Babylon, near what is now modern-day Baghdad. And then there's a difference of opinion about the route that St. Thomas took to get to India. The Mar Thoma Church, the ancient church and the Syrian Church of India, all lay claim to St. Thomas as being their founder. So did he get to India through the Silk Road, traveling over by land, through places like Iran and Afghanistan? Most scholars think actually he went by sea, and the most common trading route from Baghdad was to travel south by boat into the Arabian Gulf, traveling past Abu Dhabi, traveling to Sohar, and then taking the well-trod sea route over to what is now Cochin, where St. Thomas is alleged to have landed. And along the way, he established communities of faith. So the ancient Eastern Church, or the Assyrian Church of the East, sort of traced their founding of these extremely old church communities back to St. Thomas, following the trade routes established by the Jewish community, because what we've noticed with the early apostles, that many of them went to where they had connections. And within the Jewish world, that was often through trade and going along well-established traveling routes where they would meet extended members of a family and in the process introduce them to the Christian faith. So we see St. Thomas following the trade, well-established Jewish trade and routes, and along the way, as empires began to rise and fall in that part of the world, Christian tribes who had come to faith through the early missionaries were forced to choose which empire they had to swear allegiance to. And in a tribal society, there's no individual culture. There's no, what I decide I'm going to convert to this religion. Tribal culture is more about the we than the I. And so when a tribal sheikh said, okay, folks, we need to be friendly with this tribe and this empire, we are all going to convert to their ideology and their doctrine. You just did it. And that's what happened in many of the Middle Eastern tribes, is that the sheikh decided Christianity was going to be their religion because it was beneficial to their relationship with surrounding powers. And that's how we end up with tribes who historically have been Christian for centuries, including some of the leading Islamic tribes in the Arabian Gulf today, can trace their origins back to the Christian tribes way back in time. Then came persecution. And the persecution came from various quarters in Yemen. We had the Jewish kingdom, the Himayat kingdom, who persecuted the Christian community terribly, and many of them fled into the area we now call Oman. From the Persian side, you had the Sasanian Empire, who really specialized in the most horrifying tortures you could imagine for the Christian community. I don't know if you've got the stomach for it, but I did detail some of the torture they used, and all I could conclude was no wonder they fled. And so many of them found a haven of safety in what is now Oman and in places like Qatar and so on. Of course, I talked about trade, and the Christians very quickly found their niche in the trading world. Pearls and wine were part of the pearling industry. Bahrain at one point, the Sasanian Empire, when it was feeling kindly towards the church, gave sole monopoly of the wine trade to the Christians in Bahrain, who basically flogged alcohol all over the Arabian Gulf. And we're talking around the 4th, 5th century. And that's what they did. They brought wine from the monasteries of Egypt and basically plied their trade in the Arabian Gulf at that time. The Church of the East then became more and more established. They started building monasteries and churches in places like Kuwait, and then Eastern Saudi Arabia, where a number of monasteries which have been discovered. In Qatar, we found a village called the Nazarene, which is the Quranic word for the Christians. And indeed, we're beginning to believe there was a formidable center of learning there. Some of the great theologians of the Church of the East came from Beit Qatreya, or Beth Qatreya, the house of Qatar. And they established some of the earliest liturgies and commentaries on scripture out of Qatar. And moving further east, you then come to another diocese known as Beit al-Mazan. Mazan was the Persian word for what we now know as Oman. And there we run into trouble because the church in Qatar was overseen from Baghdad, who used the language of Syriac, as their liturgical language and language of church communications. But in Beit al-Mazan, they use the language of Persian as their main sort of lingua franca, which the monks and the church used in their liturgy. And so, as you can see, very quickly there became a linguistic and cultural division between the two churches, eventually leading to the church in Oman sort of being responsible for overseeing the church in Soha. And what we tend to forget is the church in the East was actually much bigger in the early century than the church in the West. Thousands and thousands of Christian churches and communities were planted all the way as far as China. Indeed, when Marco Polo traveled to China, he really was genuinely expecting to be the only Christian there, and was somewhat put out to find that the Church of East had been there several centuries before he was. And those Christians who brought the gospel to China were Christians who were originally based in Soha, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, traveling further east in their journey. And so in time, as the Islamic Empire grew, Arabic replaced Syriac as the language of the church. And we can see very early on the influence of the church councils. Some of the earliest church councils, ecumenical church councils, had bishops from Soha, bishops from Qatar and Bahrain showed up, and they were duly recorded with their contributions in those places. So the church is old, been well established. There were monasteries, there were learning centers. There was a theological school there which rivaled the ancient Syriac school of Edessa and other places like it. All lost since then. And one of the big mysteries for the academic is what happened next. There was a great silence between the 10th century and the 16th century. There are no records of the Christian church in the Arabian Gulf. And there are different theories on what happened. One is as Islam became more and more predominant in the area, many Christians just simply assimilated and found it was easier to do business as a follower of Islam than as a somewhat more misunderstood Christian religion. So assimilation was a real possibility, and indeed some of the earliest church communications written by the bishops in Baghdad were lamenting the number of converts who were turning to Islam in order to succeed in the business side of their work, and who was lamenting the fickle Christian faith of his flock for being turned so easily by money and wealth. So it's interesting to reflect on what that would look like today if something similar happened in this part of the world. Assimilation, there was persecution. There is another reason why there was assimilation suggested by Pastor Glubb, which was Christianity simply did not make sense to the Arab people. The big disputes about Trinity, the disputes about the divine will of Jesus, and all of that was just for the Arab desert dweller, was just beyond them. It was nonsense. And the pastor and the Christian fought with one another. For the Arab who grew up in the open skies of the desert, the call of Islam just made so much more sense, so much more simple than having to wrestle with the ancient sort of Trinitarian controversies of the church at the time. So similarly, people converted to Islam because it made more sense in their culture. We talked about the persecution. As persecution became more and more widespread, some by the Islamic armies as they grew more and more, Christians were pushed further and further east, places like India and China. Through its migration, people followed the money, where they could be faithfully Christian and exercise their trade without being subjugated to a second-class citizenship. Here's another reason why there's a great silence, though, is we've lost all the letters the early church wrote. The Church of the East was there, but we're writing still letters and keeping records of finances. And a lot of those records were lost through natural disasters, through buildings being burned down. But recently, a scholar traveled to Iran, to Homs, which is the city, the holy city in Iran, where many of the universities of Islam are based. And he was astonished to find that in one of the basements of one of these ancient universities was a massive collection of Syriac letters, commentaries, which have not seen the light of day yet, just begging for investigation to be translated into other languages and perhaps discover the great silence wasn't so silent after all. So there's a source we know of ancient documents which as yet no Western scholar has had access to. So we've got the lost libraries. The information we do have been found more or less by chance from ancient monasteries which haven't yet sort of burned some of their old bits of paper lying around, have preserved some of the old letters which have now been collected more and more by scholars, realizing what they represent. One of the last references we get to Christianity in the 9th century was a lovely story about the pearl divers in Bahrain being afraid to go out to sea because there was a great big shark attacking the pearl divers as they went into the water. And so it said the local people decided to call upon the Christian to offer prayer to their God to deliver them from the shark. And the story goes that God answered their prayers by sending lots of tiny little fish to lodge itself in the gills of the shark so it couldn't breathe. And in the end, it rose to the surface dead, resulting in great rejoicing from the pearl diving community because God had answered their prayers and they were able to go out to sea and the pearling industry was saved. That's the last known written reference to the Christian community in the Persian Gulf. A very charming story. So I've talked about the access to the monastic libraries. Until the 16th century. So I tend to think of Christian history in the Arabian Free period, the first period of the early church, the Church of the East established in the monastic communities. The second period is this great silence. And then comes along the exposure to the Arabian Gulf, to Western Christianity. And this is Alfonso de Albuquerque, who I've learned now over the years to boo every time I see his image. He was a thoroughly ambitious, corrupt, ruthless leader of the Portuguese expedition trading all the way to India. The first record we have of Western Christianity arriving in Arabia was at Khor Khan, which is now part of the United Arab Emirates. And it talks about Alfonso de Albuquerque sending these Marines on shore where the local people had gathered to welcome them. And very quickly they put them to sword. Those who survived were mutilated, they had their ears and nose cut off. And then it says in the record that they celebrated Holy Communion on the beach, giving thanks to God for their great victory. How on earth do you overcome a legacy that appalling? But Alfonso de Albuquerque did leave a legacy. He left Portuguese castles and forts, and for those of you who've been to Muscat will have seen the two sort of forts overlooking the harbour and the mountaintop. Those were all sort of extensions of Portuguese power, which they used military intimidation to keep the local people under control. Not a very auspicious start to the exposure of Christianity in Arabia. The Portuguese were eventually competing with the Dutch, and then after the Dutch, the British came. So the gentleman wearing the long frock coat, it's on the right on my screen, is Thomas Valpy French, who was a CMS bishop, who was a bishop in what we now know as Pakistan for 40 years. And then God laid on his heart the burden to tackle and confront the slave industry. What's not so well known is that Muscat was the main port trading for East African slaves. And so Thomas Volpifant traveled to Muscat in order to confront the local people on the slave industry, and he was in the vanguard of raising awareness from Britain about their opposition to the slave trade. And of course, William Wilberforce was eventually successful in making that law in the British context. And then missionaries travelled out from Wilberforce sort of school of thought across the empire to bring that message elsewhere. And so the slave trade has quite an interesting record of early Christian missionaries and travellers there. The local people tolerated it, and they just simply quietly relocated slaving centres to less known harbours on the front. But outwardly, they complied. And there are some of the earliest documents we have between local Arab authorities and the British government are treaties promising, among other things, to abolish the slave trade and to allow religious freedom. Following Thomas Volpifant died not long after he arrived in Oman. There are different theories as to why he died. He died on a boat traveling from one port to another, wearing a big, thick woolen cassock. And in the heat of the day, some say he died from a heat stroke. And Oman is one of the hottest countries in the world. It really, I cannot begin to imagine wearing a black cassock in the heat of sun in Oman. But he was very, very poorly. Moving on, following him came an astonishing American traveller called Samuel Rema, who established mission centres in the Middle East across the Arabian Gulf. He was an extraordinary character, incredibly intelligent, got to grips with the Arabic language, and very quickly learned that the Islamic population were not going to convert to Christianity very easily. And so he came up with the method, if you like, of pioneering medical mission in Arabia. And although he did not train as a medical doctor or a dentist, it did not stop him from having a go. And there's some quite amusing anecdotes where he's pulling out the wrong teeth on various local people who were incredibly trusting, assuming that because he was a Westerner, he had this magical medical knowledge that would help them cope with their various afflictions. But very quickly he realized that medicine was the way to go. That's what the local people needed. And so he sent an appeal back to America to send out medical missionaries, and very, very quickly came and established hospitals, some of the first hospitals in the region, in Kuwait, in Oman, and Bahrain, and Basra, some of which are still standing and operating to this day. So the first photograph on top there is a gentleman called Sharon Toms, who was one of the first missionaries to come. And very quickly he walked into a firestorm because one of the tensions in Oman is that they collected tax from all the maritime traders. They had money, and the tribes in the interior had no money. And so there was always an excuse to accuse each other of not being religious enough or not being Islamic enough, according to who they hosted and how they spent their money. So when Sharon Toms arrived in Muscat, he arrived at the most unfortunate time where the conservative religious leader in the interior of Oman was accusing the Sultan of allowing Christian missionaries to do their work in an Islamic country. So he had quite a hard time being accepted, but very quickly he established a clinic which in turn served thousands and thousands of people. When you look at the statistics of the numbers of people they treated, it was astonishing. Then he was followed shortly after that. There were women there, of course, which is Dr. Sarah Hussman. She was a formidable lady who really was quite extremist in her Christianity. One of the stories about her, she had a wooden leg, and when she lost her temper, which easily happened, she would take her leg off and beat people with it. Somehow doesn't seem very Christian, and she thought the men of the medical mission were rather wimpy, and in the end left them in disgust to set up her own hospital, which became the first missionary hospital in what is now the United Arab Emirates in Sharjah, where she was much loved by the local people. I don't think she hit them with a wooden leg as much as she did in Oman. But the kind of approach she took was she was so desperate for people to convert to Christianity, she would literally lock them in a cupboard and not let them out until they agreed to convert. And so I think the other members of the missionary team breathed a huge sigh of relief when she left. She was replaced by another remarkable doctor, Dr. Harrison, this gentleman here, who really laid the groundwork for the hospital in Kuwait. And had he stayed in America, he would have been one of the leading doctors at Harvard and Princeton. He created many of the medical techniques used in tropical medicine to this day, much of it through experimenting on himself. The local butcher would recall how he would go and buy things from the local shop to carve up various animals and dissect them in order to improve his anatomical skills and his surgery. He died eventually testing poison on himself. So he really was committed to the very bitter end. But a huge loss to medicine and the early church there. Here's a video made by Wells Toms, made it around the 1950s. I will only play a little bit of it, but it captured the flavor of how the Americans portrayed the Omanis. Bearing in mind that Americans really did not know very much about the Middle East at that time. Some argue they still don't. Thanks to the work of Samuel Zwemer, who created, among other things, the Muslim World Journal, which is probably one of the leading academic study journals of Islam today, the missionary did a great service in promoting better understanding of Arab culture and religion in the West. And here's a very old clip of mission work in Oman. I'm going to see if it plays.
I first arrived as a medical missionary in Oman on board a ship, the British India Steamship Company steamer that brought Peter with my family, my wife, and 4 children. Of course, from that viewpoint, Oman looked very rugged. The mountains rose sheer from the sea, big, black, basaltic mountains. And I wondered where the harbor was, because it seemed as if the ship was heading right for destruction. It seemed to be heading straight for these precipitous mountains. But suddenly it took a right angle turn, and then we were in the harbor. Here, a perfectly circular harbor, which once upon a time had been a volcanic crater, and on the shore we gleamed the white houses, the Sultan's towers, the British consul, and some of the more prosperous merchants' homes. On both sides of the harbor were these great Portuguese forts, which...
So you can see some of the Portuguese castles in that film, which is still standing to this day. So how is it, after such a terrible start and introduction to the Christian faith, thanks to Alfonso de Albuquerque, that Christians found a welcome home in Oman today? And part of the story involves Sultan Qaboos, who came to power in the 1970s after inheriting essentially a country that was still very backwards in terms of exposure to technology. They still didn't really have much in the way of oil. And he was sent to England as a child to be out of harm's way, because Oman had a lot of fighting going on between the different tribes. And when he was 17, I think, he was sent to a little village in England, and the British Foreign Office decided to put him with an Anglican vicar in the middle of nowhere. And the Anglican vicar understood he was Muslim, and he created a prayer room for the young Sultan to pray in. And it was there that Sultan Qaboos was exposed to organ music, the church organ. And to this day, Oman is home to the biggest organ in the Middle East. That's where he fell in love with all of that thing. It's located in the Muscat Opera House. And it was there he was exposed to the Anglican brand of Christianity. And many years later, he was telling a Catholic bishop who I was interviewing as part of my research, but he told the bishop that vicar let him pray in his home, and he would allow the Christians to pray in Hebrew. And so you could see the personal influence of the Sultan behind the ethic of welcome and hospitality in Oman to this day. And there are lots of stories about Sultan Qaboos and his various interactions with church leaders over time, nearly all of them positive. But still insisting that as a Muslim, they should respect Islam. And as long as they respected Islam, he would grant freedom to worship. Not freedom of religion, and there is a distinction. Freedom of religion suggests anyone, anytime, can believe whatever they want. That definitely was not allowed in Oman. But freedom to worship, if you already had a faith, you were free to practice it in that country. And because of a well-established medical mission, the missionaries eventually became a vital part of providing the emerging Omani nation's infrastructure and the health service. Here we've got Donald Bosk and Eloise Bosk receiving the very rare honor of becoming the equivalent, if you like, of knights and ladies of Omani society, and they were given a grace and favor home on the beach where they lived and died as honored members of Sultan society. And it's not just Westerners. That's the other thing I've discovered with history is we tend to only rely on Western sources. But the Indian Christian community are massive in the Middle East. The Filipino Christian community has a huge presence, but there's little research to tell their stories and the impact they had on local people there. The Alamana Center was set up by the Reformed Church in America initially as a school for slaves who were liberated by the British. It eventually became a medical center, and today it is a center of building trust and peace, an interfaith place and peacemaking. I was the chair of our board for a number of years, and it's been there for 125 years. And much of the interfaith work takes place in partnership with the Omani government, bringing in various parties from outside of the country, bringing them into the center, and talking about how people can be reconciled in areas of conflict. So, for example, they have hosted Palestinians and Jews from Israel. It's extraordinary in the Alamana Center. They've hosted competing tribes in Nigeria between Muslims and Christians. They've hosted people in places like Pakistan between Muslim and Christian leaders there. And the Omanis, who are renowned for their quietist diplomacy, encourage this kind of work to take place. And indeed, we have an Omani member of staff as part of the team who help the team to deliver their training, which is becoming more and more known across the world. The leader of the Omani Ministry of Religious Affairs is this gentleman here, whose grandfather, great-grandfather, was one of the leading Abadi scholars who wrote the commentary on how Christians could be welcomed in Oman, and he embodies that theology to this day in his leadership of the Abadi community in Oman. So what did I conclude? Did Islamic theology shape the nature of Christian church relations with the state across the Middle East? I found the conclusion was more nuanced and more complicated than that. Whether with trade, we found that Islamic culture was more open to the religious other. And so actually the economy played a big part in the level of religious tolerance in different parts of the Middle East. Islamic theology did play a part, but not as much as I thought it did originally. And tribal culture. Tribal culture is shaped by their leaders. And if you had a leader who was known for being open-hearted and intellectually curious about either like Sheikh Zayed was of the United Arab Emirates, then you found a tolerance which surpassed people's expectations. And that became the conclusion of my work. So today I delight in telling people the church in the Arabian Gulf is flourishing, it's international, it's large, and yes, we have freedom to worship, but not necessarily freedom of religion. I'll conclude my presentation.